Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins and for Mike Papantonio this week. Coming up on today's show, we'll be taking a look at how some charities are taking advantage of the generosity of American citizens and pocketing millions of dollars in the process. The GOP has once again taken it upon themselves to launch a war on women, and we'll find out why they decided to resurrect a strategy that helped destroy their campaigns in last year's election cycle. And the Environmental Protection Agency has dropped the ball when it comes to regulating hydraulic fracturing, and we'll tell you why this is putting citizens and the environment at risk. We have all that and more coming up, but right now, you've just entered the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
I want to begin today by addressing the recent George Zimmerman trial verdict. Zimmerman was found not guilty in court, and the verdict has left a lot of Americans feeling very angry. Social media was abuzz in the days following the verdict. Protests and vigils took place all over America, and more importantly, Trayvon Martin's family was denied justice for the murder of their son. Make no mistake, George Zimmerman got away with murder. Whether justified as he claimed or not, Zimmerman took it upon himself to end the life of another human being. To say that Zimmerman took the law into his own hands shows a gross misunderstanding of the incident. Zimmerman was told by the 911 operator to remain in his vehicle and not approach Trayvon Martin. He defied that and approached an unarmed teenager who was not breaking any law. He instigated a confrontation, and then he killed Trayvon Martin. The police were on their way to investigate the possibility of wrongdoing, but George Zimmerman took that opportunity away from them. He didn't help the law, he made a mockery of it. For those claiming that race didn't play a role in this because George Zimmerman himself is Hispanic, that is, quite simply, an ignorant argument to make. Again, the 911 call proved that Zimmerman was angry about an African-American teenager walking down his block, and according to Zimmerman's own words, people like Martin, quote, always get away. But there's a reason this became a national story that goes beyond a murder. The reason we talked about it was because of the stand your ground laws that allowed Zimmerman to murder Trayvon Martin. Stand your ground laws that are being pushed by organizations like ALEC all over the country and supported by right-wing politicians. Trayvon Martin's family has several legal avenues ahead of them that they can pursue, but there is only one mechanism in place to stop another stand your ground murder, and that is you, the American voter. You can educate yourself about who ALEC supports, which politicians are in bed with them, and what they plan to do to your state if elected. You can show up at the polls and vote out extremist politicians who believe that murder is okay. The solution to this problem is you. If you choose to not act, then don't become indignant when the next murder happens. And now, on to other issues. When you give money to a charity, you do so under the assumption that the money you donate is going to a worthy cause. Unfortunately, that isn't always the case. In recent years, more and more charity scams have been popping up, and I have investigative journalist Rick Outzen with me now to discuss some of the biggest charity scams in America. So Rick, rather than helping those in need, it seems like a lot of charities out there today are really just preying on the kindness of American citizens. Is that what you found?
Yeah, really. I mean, what we're looking at, and the Tampa Bay Times did a great job on this with the help of the Center for Investigative Reporting, and they listed the 50 worst charities, and they use innocuous names or names that are slightly like the authentic charities. And they really are just shells for these private consulting groups and fundraising groups to just rake off millions of dollars for themselves, and less than 2 to 3% end up going to the cause that they're for. I mean, the number one group or foundation was Kids Wish Network, which kind of sounds like Make-A-Wish, Farron, but it's not. It raised millions and millions of dollars, paid itself huge salaries. More than 90% of the money went to the fundraisers, not to the kids in need.
Well, I think a lot of times too, and you nailed it with that, is that they're picking names that are so similar to something else out there, not quite the same. So when they call up these people, they do these cold calls. Actually, I many years ago, I used to work at one of these telemarketing firms, and I was there for 2 days. We were soliciting funds for a fire department up in Nebraska, I believe, and that was located in Gulf Breeze, Florida. Now, the reason I left, the second day I was there, I asked the people, I said, well, exactly how much of this money is going to these firefighters in Nebraska? Why are we in Florida raising money for firefighters in Nebraska? And they said, well, it's only about 10 to 15% of the money is going to make it up there. But they tried to justify it by saying, look, we have call centers all over the country, we do marketing, we give out these stickers and a t-shirt if you donate enough. So that has to make up for the rest. That's where most of the money's going. And of course, they were very adamant about, plus this is paying your salary. And I said, well,
right.
Not anymore. But that seems to be what's happening across the country. They pick a name that sounds like something well-known, like Kids Wish, which, like you said, sounds like Make-A-Wish. They're essentially stealing money from people, and it's not going to really help anybody, is it?
No, it's not. I mean, I've got the list of the top 10 charities that made this worst charities in America. Kids Wish Network was number 1. Cancer Fund of America. Cancer's another big word that works with these charities. Children's Wish Foundation International. American Breast Cancer Foundation. And then the other one is to go after law enforcement or firefighters. Number 5 on the list is Firefighters Charitable Foundation. Raised $64 million over the last 10 years. Less than 2% of it actually made it to any firefighters or into any foundation helping firefighters. We got the International Union of Police Association, the National Veteran Service Fund. This is really a scam. I mean, it's really bad, and we've got to do something about it.
Right. Well, where's the money going? If somebody donates $100 to this charity and 2 or 3% goes to the charity, where does that other 97%, where is all that money going?
Well, it's going to the fundraisers. Then these charities hire consulting companies, which are owned by the people that founded the charity. It goes to buy cars, it goes into salaries. It's really spread over a very small group of people who get very, very wealthy. The Tampa Tribune, the Tampa Bay Times, in doing this story, they located a charity, Woman-to-Woman Breast Fund, in Florida, and they found that they got sought out by one of these fundraisers. They were taking in, at the time, for their little foundation, they might take in $10,000 or $15,000 a year. They're now taking in millions of dollars. All the founders have paid themselves salaries. They now have cars for the husband and the wife and the daughter. And the fundraiser is making millions upon. They've raised over $6 million in their last reporting period. And they're averaging $10,000 to $12,000 a year actually going to help with mammograms out of $6 million. But they seek these people out, and it's a target-rich environment.
And a lot of times, too, from that Tampa Bay Times story, is that these companies or these charities will actually be set up for nothing more than the benefit of the family that runs them, their own companies. There was one in South Florida, I believe, where they started this charity, but then they paid their son, hundreds of thousands of dollars to make videos for the charity. They were paying his company to make the videos for the charity. And so this is a way they can pull in all this money, they can justify the expense on paper, but it's staying in the family. It's not going out there, it's not helping the people who need it. And so, what do we do? What does a consumer do? How do we know if we get that soliciting phone call, if we get that email, if we get that mail out? How do we find out who's good and who's not?
Well, the Better Business Bureau does a great job of it. The Federal Trade Commission recommends getting to know the charity. If someone calls, check it out. Be sure the name is exactly what you think it is. Ask if the caller is a paid fundraiser. How much does it actually go to benefit the people that the charity is supposed to be helping? Don't ever give out any personal information on any credit cards. Don't mail cash. Check with, there are tons of websites out there to check out these charities. Better Business Bureau does a great job. You've got the Charity Navigator, Charity Watch. GuideStar will let you look at the actual tax returns of these companies. But it's very, very, you have to go into it skeptical whenever you get a phone call about any charity. If it says cancer, if it says firefighter, if it says law and order, it's, you know, kids, it's sadly more often than not it's a scam. The good charities don't do this.
Right, and another thing that the story from South Florida brought up is that a charity should never give less than 65% of the money that they bring in to the actual charity. So if you get that phone call, if they say, well, we give 40% to our consultants, that's not right. It should never be more than 35% going to consultants and salaries and staff and all of that, 65% a bare minimum to go to the charity. And speaking of which, these consultants that come out and they meet with these charities, because there are a lot of charities that start in this country that have the best of intentions. Mm-hmm. But then you have these greedy, you know, money-hungry consultants that come out there. They co-opt these charities, and they raise millions upon millions of dollars for them. But then what happens after these consultants get a hold of these charities?
Right. Well, they settled. I mean, they settled because let's say they're doing a golf tournament. Maybe they bring in 8,000 to 10,000, maybe even 20,000. These consultants come in and say, okay, I can double that for you. You can make $50,000 a year if you let us handle your fundraising. Now, they don't tell them necessarily that they're going to be raising, you know, $10 million, of which you're going to get 50,000. But you know, over time, that number keeps going up, and they start realizing that they can now take a salary, that they can pay their kids, and they're sort of guided in how to scam the system. You know, like you said, how can you set up a video company that your child can run, or how can you, if you're going to do research, you know, pay your company, another company that you own, to do the research project that you want done. You know, it really does prey on people, and we just barely touched on it, Farron, but the other piece is they really prey on the elderly. When they're calling people, they're preying on some of the older people in our community and playing off of their emotions, saying the word cancer, saying the words kids, getting them into a conversation, and then once they tap that well, they're going to go back over and over again asking for more money, possibly a different charity or even the same charity, but they will take that money from the people that at least can afford to do it.
Well, Rick Outzen, publisher of the Independent Weekly, thank you so much for telling us this story today.
Thank you, Farron.
Coming up, we'll find out why Republicans have decided to continue the war on women, even though it failed them miserably in last year's election. I'm Farron Cousins, and we'll be right back with more Ring of Fire.
Stand up, stand up.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins, and for Mike Papantonio this week. In the last few weeks, Republican lawmakers from all over the country have made it clear that the war on women is alive and well by introducing a host of new bills that attack a woman's right to make decisions about her own body. Joining me now to talk about the ongoing war on women, a war that Republicans continue to lose, is Nancy Cohen, author of the book Delirium, The Politics of Sex in America. Nancy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Farron, great to be here with you.
I think it's an interesting point that in the 2012 election, the war on women backfired tremendously on Republicans. They lost the female vote by, I believe, 11%. And so, as we've seen all over the country, though, they haven't given up. In fact, they've actually doubled down.
Yeah, you would think that they had learned their lesson in the 2012 election. You know, if women had split their votes equally in 2012, Mitt Romney would be president now by 4 million votes. Pretty amazing. So much for that. They haven't learned their lesson. So I think the question is, why didn't they learn it? Why are we seeing this in the states when the Democrats and women won on a national level? And ultimately, what can we do about it? And the why is that as we see, the Republican Party is controlled, it's owned by sexual fundamentalists who really care most about depriving women of our rights.
Well, I think it's interesting that you brought up the fact that they're doing this state by state rather than trying to do anything on the federal level. And you know, when you break it down and you look at these states like Texas and Arkansas, you really see how these individual groups view women as a whole. You know, take us through some of these. You know, like what is going on in Texas right now?
Yes, in Texas, during the regular session, Republicans needed to work with Democrats, so they said, oh, we're not going to do anything about abortion. We did that last year. They had passed mandatory sonogram laws previously. And so they get through what they want in the regular session, and they hold this special session, which is only about abortion. And it's a kind of stealth move where everybody's talking about, oh, it's a 20-week ban. But what it really is all these regulations on abortion clinics that will force something like 37 of the 42 clinics in Texas to close. And as we see, they had to cheat to try to get it through the first time. We saw that with that wonderful filibuster, and then they lost that, so they just keep coming back to do it.
So they're in a special session right now for the sole purpose of taking rights away from women. I mean, there's no other way to shape that. They've done this only to attack women. And in a state like Texas, you know, we end up with this great hero in Wendy Davis, but is that going to change anything? I mean, what do you think the odds are that this is going to pass?
I think it's very strong. It's going to pass. You know, they got the advantage of time with the earlier special session, so this will pass. And Rick Perry has made it clear he's just going to keep bringing it back. Let's take a look at a state like Ohio, which actually went for Obama in the election. Still has one Democratic senator, but they did a stealth attack through the budget where they attached all these anti-abortion riders to the budget, including one that will prevent rape clinics from telling rape victims that abortion is an option.
And like you said, they did that through the backdoor approach. John Kasich added it to the bill, so it did not even go to the floor for a vote, correct?
Correct. Well, it had been folded into the budget bill, you know, in an omnibus budget bill, and he had the option to line item veto it, and he didn't. And, you know, this is a case where a governor is going to try to win re-election, and he's actually accepted Medicaid expansion, which, you know, a lot of the Republican right is against. But what these abortion regulations show us, I think, is how central this is to today's Republican Party. That a governor feels like the one thing he can't go against his party on is anti-women extremism.
Right. And, you know, I think it's important that you mentioned a lot of these bills out there are actually trying to shut down these quote unquote abortion clinics. But that term in itself is a misnomer. An abortion clinic is not a place where they just, you know, perform abortions all day long. They do vital medical testing and screening and services for women. They do these breast cancer screenings, you know, mammograms, all sorts of reproductive health services for women. So to call something an abortion clinic, which is something they do all the time, paints the picture. Americans visualize just a assembly line of nothing but abortions. And nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, these buildings, these services are essential for women, and they're being shut down with these new bills.
Exactly. These are health centers that provide family planning. They do the cancer screenings. In many of these states where there are a lot of poor women who are uninsured, they're the only doctor's visits that women receive in the entire year.
And these would be in part funded by the Affordable Care Act when those provisions take place, if they haven't already. But now the Republicans are even trying to make bills that will prevent that. They don't want the government funding any of these vital services for women. And that's the thing that people don't understand. You know, again, they want to say that this is an abortion issue, and it's not. It is an overall attack on the health of women across the country. And so what I'm curious as is to bring it up, they should have learned they could have learned. They know that this tactic doesn't work. And is it just so ingrained in their DNA as a party that they have this disdain for women? I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, it's ingrained in the DNA of the activist base of the Republican Party. Really only maybe 15% of the country agree with these radical extremist bills that they're putting through. But that is the 15% of the Republican Party that's really engaged in primaries. You know, I call them sexual fundamentalists. In my book Delirium, I talk about how they actually organized not on abortion, but back in the 70s to defeat the Equal Rights Amendment. So a lot of these states that are passing these draconian regulations on women's health have also repealed or voted down equal pay legislation for women.
Right, and right now we're looking at, I believe, so far this year, 300 bills in state legislatures from coast to coast have been introduced. So this is not just a couple of bad apples, a couple of regressive politicians in these red states. This is all over the place, and now, thanks to people like Marco Rubio, it is finally trickling up all the way to Washington, D.C. So what are they doing on the federal level now to make this happen?
On the federal level, the House passed a 20-week ban, and this is kind of the wedge for the Republican right to start chipping away at Roe v. Wade. And Rubio is about to introduce it in the Senate. You know, the scuttlebutt is that the right wing is dissatisfied with him for supporting immigration reform. So this is his payback to show, I'm a true believer, I'm really with you. And the fact is, Rubio is a true believer on this stuff. He is a very Orthodox Catholic who has had really fiery rhetoric that for anybody who cares about the separation of church and state should be really worried about a Rubio presidential candidacy.
Right. And, bringing it back to all these laws, federal, state, whatever it is, the ultimate goal is for these to be challenged in court, correct? And so once they can get that to happen, it can then, whether it's upheld or not, they can then appeal it all the way to the Supreme Court. And so what's the end game? What's the end game with these laws?
Good question. The end game is right now, this Supreme Court will probably uphold Roe v. Wade. So they are in kind of their last throes. If we have another Democratic president after Obama, there is almost nil chance that there will be Supreme Court justices who will overturn Roe v. Wade. If we get a Republican president, it's almost certain that we would have Roe v. Wade overturned. And a lot of this hinges on Ruth Bader Ginsburg's age. It's hard to imagine her surviving, 8 years through 2 terms of a Republican presidency.
So with this continuation of the war on women, I personally happen to see it as the Republicans know that they cannot win on economic issues. They can't win on foreign policy. They can't win on, basically anything. So what they do is they take their hardcore, their true believing base, and they bring back the culture wars in America. Is that how you see it?
I actually see it a little differently. I think what we see by them kowtowing to the cultural warriors is how dependent they are on them as the only active Republicans. So I don't think the culture wars are a distraction. I think it's the main show for the most committed Republicans. And I think that certain Republican national figures, someone like maybe a Jeb Bush or someone like a Chris Christie, are in a real bind because they probably aren't true believers, but they know they have no other option. So I think that these people are outnumbered 3-1 in public opinion, but it's going to take really determined advocacy and organizing and political engagement for the majority to kind of hold these sexual fundamentalists at bay, because they will not stop pushing this issue on depriving women of their rights. And the Republican establishment has no other voters now to go to.
And so what happens, what is the net effect when you have female commentators or female politicians, who are out there also actively pushing this? When they can put a woman's face on a female issue saying, yes, we should have a 20-week abortion ban. What does that do for the base? What does that give them?
That gives them cover in our point that they're anti-women. Because, yeah, they say, well, we're pro-women. Yes, they're pro-women being submissive to their husbands and not getting equal pay and, first and foremost, devoting themselves to children and maybe having some PIM money on the side. And so I think, it's a wake-up call to us that we have to be careful to talk about how the way we're pro-women is pro-women's equality, pro-gender equality, and that there are a lot of men in our party and in the country who are totally on board with that.
Well, and again, that's the problem when you have a party like the GOP made up of old, gray-haired white men. That's the majority of their voting base. That's the majority of their elected officials, and they're the ones who are out there trying to make these decisions about what women can and cannot do with their own reproductive health. But Nancy Cohen, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Farron. It was great to be here.
Nancy Cohen is the author of the book Delirium, The Politics of Sex in America. Follow her on Twitter at Nancy L. Cohen. And when we come back, we'll find out why the Environmental Protection Agency has decided to ignore the health and environmental dangers associated with hydraulic fracturing. I'm Farron Cousins, and you're watching Ring of Fire. We'll be right back.
You're watching Free Speech TV, a network powered by the people.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins in for Mike Papantonio this week. For several years, the EPA has been back and forth on whether or not to implement stricter standards on hydraulic fracturing. And recently, it was revealed that the EPA actually intervened on behalf of fracking companies to prevent investigations into their dangerous practices. Joining me now to discuss the EPA's actions and the dangers of fracking are Brendan DeMelle, managing editor of DeSmogBlog.com, and investigative journalist Steve Horn. Guys, thanks for joining me today. Brendan, I want to start with you. Now, before we get into the current actions of the EPA, I think it's important to take everybody back a couple years to the Bush administration, because a lot of the lack of regulations today stems from actions taken by the Bush administration.
That's right. Dick Cheney's Halliburton CEO in 2005, we all know about the secret meetings he had with the oil executives planning for their energy policy. The 2005 Energy Act came out, and it had this giant loophole allowing fracking to escape the EPA's regulations for safe drinking water. So that's a huge, giant, not even a barn door. You're talking about an airplane hangar door that the industry get to walk right through, and allows them to do anything they want as far as water safety. It's really and I think that's why we're seeing so much uprising among concerned citizens who are now, second guessing whether or not the fracking boom is such a great thing.
Right, and the EPA was tasked with finding out if the fracking boom was even safe enough for citizens to be able to drink their water. And they had launched investigations in several areas across the country. And Steve, what's the current status of a lot of those investigations? I mean, what's the EPA still doing?
Sure. So its two most high-profile investigations were essentially both dropped, both interesting stories. One of them had to do with a water contamination case in Weatherford, Texas, dating back to the end of 2010 through early 2012. During that time, a man by the name of Steve Lipsky had his water contaminated by Range Resources, which ended up with the EPA basically enforcing the laws on the books and doing a full throttle investigation of what happened. It sent out a scientist by the name of Jeffrey Thine to investigate the scene in Weatherford, Texas. He did 34 water samples, went through the whole motion of doing pretrial discovery with those samples, and then in March of 2012, during an election year, EPA decided that it would be best and to basically end this study. So the study itself was dropped and censored, but also the lawsuit that the EPA was going through between late 2010 and early 2012 was dropped. So
the EPA actually had gotten to the point where they said, look, we need to have a lawsuit on this. We understand that this this fluid being pumped into the ground is leaking into ground wells. It's coming out in people's faucets. It's coming out of their water hoses. You know, the infamous pictures of people lighting their tap on fire. They had a lawsuit on this, and they've dropped it?
Yeah, and you know, you talk about the visual of the water on fire. In Gasland too, Steve Lipsky's water, you can actually see it from a hose in his backyard that you could take a match to it and start it on fire because there's so much methane laced in his water. The EPA, off the record, would acknowledge him that the water is not drinkable, that he shouldn't drink it. You know, he'd get really sick if he drank it, his family drank it. But the bottom line is that on the record, an official EPA death statement is that there was nothing more to follow up on, and case closed in March 2012. So
that's unbelievable.
Yeah,
and Brendan, I know a lot of the work over at DeSmogBlog concentrates on finding the industry influence. And in this particular story, the EPA stopping these investigations, it's not just the EPA acting alone. There is some outside pressure coming in, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's been an industry-wide sort of public relations assault on both the regulators, you know, the EPA and the Obama administration, but also you see these Energy in Depth, which is one of these groups that's active in the states where fracking is most prevalent, you know, puts out a lot of misinformation, does a lot of advertising. The American Petroleum Institute, the big oil's, you know, lobbying arm, has done a tremendous amount of advertising to confuse people about this issue and sort of make it difficult for EPA to do its job. I mean, you're seeing the regulator turning the other cheek, ending these investigations. How are they going to hold the industry accountable if they don't even finish these studies? And that's what we're seeing across the country. And it's a really big problem for people's water, for their health, for their air, and obviously for the global climate.
Right, and you mentioned Energy in Depth. They're one of my favorites. They've taken some shots at me personally, as actually you pointed out to me, which, you know, I wear that as a badge of honor. If we can make them pay attention and have to address us and personally attack us, then we're doing things correctly. You know, there's no shame in the industry going after you. But, you know,
not as a journalist or as a commentator, but it's also, you know, when those people attack the industry or attack the EPA and attack the Obama administration, you know, who can't really respond necessarily, that's when people get confused, and that's where they, you know, Energy in Depth, you know, makes their mark.
Right. And so, Steve, you know, we talked about these investigations being squashed, but, you know, let's take it a step back from that. You know, why are these investigations even necessary? I mean, we know a lot about the dangers of fracking. They're injecting this chemical cocktail into the ground of which we don't know what's in it. And from the few items we do know, they're carcinogens, correct? I mean, they're pumping cancer-causing agents into the ground to be able to extract natural gas.
Right, and I think the Lipsky story is a case in point because the peer reviewer of the study for that lawsuit was Robert Jackson, who was the author of the Duke University study. Two of them, actually. One of them just came out about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago. The most prominent one, though, came out in 2011, and that one was the first study to link fracking to groundwater contamination and things. For instance, in the Marcellus Shale, that study showed that there's something like 17 times the amount of methane laced in the water samples that they took. Other substances such as toluene, you name it, a bunch of chemicals that most Americans, if they looked into it, would be horrified that, you know, that's actually in their fellow Americans' drinking water. And so the last thing the industry wants is a government study that confirms the studies of people like Robert Jackson. But Robert Jackson, as the peer reviewer of Jeffrey Thein's study, who did that study as a contractor on behalf of the EPA, did say that the findings were sound. So although it didn't come out as an official governmental study because of the AP's reporting, we do now know that it's just another example in Weatherford, Texas, of sort of more of the same and this big overarching problem of fracking, and that's all the ecological hazards that come with it.
Right, and you know, back to the EPA again, a large part of the reason why we're not getting these studies, why these studies are being squashed, in addition to what Brendan said about the industry influence, is the senators and the Congress people who are wholly owned subsidiaries of the dirty energy industry. I think the best possible example out there is Senator James Inhofe. And Inhofe was instrumental in getting these EPA studies squashed. And then after he manages to end these investigations, actually says, you know what, I want to have an investigation into the EPA's activities in investigating the oil and gas industry. I think that is absolutely remarkable. And then if you look over at the House, the U.S. House of Representatives, I think so far this year, the oil, gas, and electric industries have already spent over $70 million in lobbying. And that's just the first, 7 months of this year. And we're already talking about those three combined are the biggest lobbying industries in Washington today. And so, but back onto the dangers, Brendan, I know one thing we've discussed in the past is the fact that fracking has been unequivocally linked. I don't care what the industry says. We just had a new study a week ago that says that fracking is causing earthquakes.
Right. So the discrepancy there, and the industry is quick to point this out, is that it's not the actual fracking that's causing the earthquake, it's the wastewater disposal. So what happens when they frack these wells is a ton of water comes back to the surface. It's laced with chemical contaminants, of course, because they pumped it down there with the chemicals. It comes back up with radioactive material because of what's in the shale. And then what they do is they turn around and take that wastewater with nothing else to do with it. They pump it back into the ground, and those disposal wells are where you're seeing a lot of fracking, wastewater activity causing these earthquakes. Whether it's in Ohio, it's a really big problem. And even in states where there isn't active fracking for the gas, they're injecting the wastewater and having this earthquake issue, which is just, it's just a tragic consequence of this, this industry gone wrong.
And the United States doesn't seem to really care about that. I know over in Great Britain, they had instances where, they linked the earthquakes to the wastewater. And so they said, hold up, we have to have a moratorium. We can't continue to potentially destroy everything in a 5, 10, 12-mile radius. So you have to stop. We need to study this. We need to figure out what's happening. But here in the United States, they say, oh, okay, well, we're getting tremors, but you guys go ahead. You keep your drilling going. And it's unbelievable how advanced the rest of the world is on energy issues altogether compared to North America. It is absolutely astounding. But we've got about 2 minutes left. I want to ask both of you. Steve, I'll start with you. About a month ago, the president issued his climate change action plan. And I know people were on the fence about it. Some environmentalists had good reviews, others did not. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, on DeSmogBlog, day of the speech, I wrote an article that really took the speech seriously and also read the climate plan. And unfortunately, one of the major aspects of his speech, not the only one, but one of the major ones was an endorsement of fracking. And then if you look at the plan itself, which the speech was about, it did endorse, sadly, every element of the fracking industry right now, from fracking all the way up to exports, and in between the Pickens plan that's will make T-Boone Pickens and clean energy fuels really rich, but won't really help a lot of everyday Americans because it's just for 18-wheelers. So I think that part of the speech alone is very troubling, given especially the Cornell study that came out in 2011, which said that if you look at the entire life cycle of fracking, it is potentially dirtier than coal for the climate. So in that regard, I think it was troubling.
Brendan, really quick, what's your thoughts on it?
Well, we're seeing, the president, unfortunately, giving even more subsidies to the industry, calling for further investment in research and development into oil and gas drilling, and also, coal, clean coal, the myth of clean coal. So we're throwing, good money at bad, and these industries are continuing to enjoy, not only the protection, but the coddling of the United States government. And it's a really sad state when a president who has a strong statement and has made some really, impressive speeches about climate change can't seem to crack the code and hold these industries accountable and start to transition us towards, the clean energy future we deserve.
Right. He's great on the stump when it comes to talking about climate change, but so far when it comes to action, we have not seen very much of that. Brendan DeMelle, Steve Horn, thank you so much for joining me today. Just ahead, we'll take a look at how GOP obstruction has caused a complete stalemate in Washington, D.C. We'll be right back, so stay with us right here on Ring of Fire.
our top political priority over the next 2 years should be to deny President Obama a second term.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins, and for Mike Papantonio this week. To say that we have a do-nothing Congress would be inaccurate. Rather than doing nothing, the Republicans in control of the House have actually been working around the clock to block all attempts at progress. Joining me now to discuss the growing problem of GOP obstruction is attorney Seth Katz. Seth, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Farron.
So this 113th Congress that we have now, the Republicans in control, have they managed to accomplish anything meaningful in the months that they've been in office yet?
Since they've been in office in January, the only thing they've accomplished is frustrating the government, frustrating democracy, and causing this government to, in essence, grind to a halt. But that seems to be their design plan.
Right, and that is the perfect word to use it, plan, because this is part of a Republican plan that came about back in January of 2009. Tell us that story.
January 2009, there was a secret, by invitation only dinner at the Caucus House restaurant in Washington, D.C. And it was a Republican-only invite. And it was designed, and everybody there pledged to make sure and frustrate the Obama administration. It was the same night as Barack Obama was sworn in as president, inaugurated his first term, and their goal, their stated objective, was to make sure nothing happens.
So this is intentional sabotage, this stalemate, this gridlock, everything we're seeing in Washington today. This is intentional. This is part of a plan. This is exactly what they wanted. More than anything, they did not want Barack Obama to be successful. It's like Rush Limbaugh said before Obama was even sworn in, I hope he fails. And that seems to be the banner that the entire Republican Party has adopted since then.
Absolutely, Farron. There's no doubt about it. You know, while I said that the dinner was a secret dinner, in the months and years since the dinner, it's been acknowledged to have happened, to have occurred, and the fallout from it is clear. I mean, the people who attended that dinner, those attendees, have filibustered more bills and killed more bills than all the other Congresses prior to them combined.
And I think so far this year, they've only sent about 15 that actually made it to the president that were actually signed into law. And again, you know, this has consequences for the American people. You know, America's credit rating has been lowered because of their inaction. They actually voted against, and this was back in 2010 or 2011, an anti-rape amendment. So this has nothing to do necessarily with their beliefs. It's all about bringing down President Obama because he's a black man for one, and he's a Democrat for two. But I think it has more to do with the first than the second on that.
I agree with you, Farron. I mean, they've passed 15 bills that have been submitted to the president for signature, and the 112th Congress, which was also fairly do nothing, passed 8 more in the same 7-month period that they had been in office, and the 15 is fewer than half of the 111th Congress in that same time. And at the same time, these same Republican lawmakers are voting no to an anti-rape bill. They're voting no to the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act to make sure that women in the workplace get paid at a fair rate, at the same rate as men. While those two bills did pass in the Senate, 30 Republican senators voted against the rape bill.
And these were bills that were widely bipartisan. There was no politicking involved in any of this. These were basic common sense measures to help the American people. You know, let's make sure that women are not discriminated against with pay. Let's make sure that if you commit a rape that you are held accountable, and we do everything possible to prevent that. And still, because of their hatred for Obama, they said, you know what, to hell with what the American public says, to hell with what's best for people, let's vote against this because we want to make him look bad. And they even used the term, this was going to be a Taliban-like insurgency. And that's exactly what's happened with these people like Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, and even though he's not there anymore, Newt Gingrich, who really helped organize all this. So we've got about a minute left here. what do we do? How can we overcome this Republican obstruction? Because it's now stopping judicial nominees and cabinet appointments. What do we do?
The media. The media is the only chance at this point. The media needs to call these Republicans on it every time that they report on a story about politics, whether it's about something Barack Obama has done that's good or whether it's something that they think is bad. They have to point out what is going on in the Congress, and they have to point out that this is intentional and it stems back to the January 20th, 2009 dinner at the Caucus House.
And unfortunately, there are so few media outlets willing to actually tell that story. Certainly, the traditional media is not going to tell that story. They've had 6 months to do it, and they failed. Seth Katz, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks, Farron.
The U.S. Supreme Court recently gave generic drug manufacturers a free pass to poison and kill American consumers. But even before that ruling, generic drug companies were subject to few, if any, federal regulations. Joining me now to discuss this is attorney Howard Nations. Howard, I think most consumers aren't aware of the fact that recently the U.S. Supreme Court pretty much completely took away any way for consumers to hold generic drug manufacturers responsible.
They did, and that's particularly important because 75% of drug sales in the United States are generic drugs. This came to a head last month in the Bartlett decision in the U.S. Supreme Court. Karen Bartlett is a very nice lady who had shoulder pain. She went to the drugstore to buy a simple generic painkiller. As a result of that painkiller, clearly her life was destroyed. Her life's been described now as a living hell. She went to trial before a New Hampshire jury in federal court in New Hampshire applying New Hampshire state law. The jury awarded $21 million for her damages, which was really not a generous award at all because the future care she's going to require is going to take up most of that. That case then went to the Supreme Court, and it gave the Roberts Court the opportunity to finish what they started in the Mensing decision, which is granting total immunity to generic drug manufacturers. In continuing their customary disdain for the American jury, the Roberts Court, the Roberts majority, overturned the jury award and held that the New Hampshire law was preempted by an FDA rule.
Right, and those FDA rules are almost saying that there are no rules. And that's what's so ironic about them turning it back over, saying the FDA rules are going to trump, because as we've seen, a great new public citizen report came out recently, there really aren't that many rules and regulations that are put in place that apply to generic drug manufacturers.
No, they pretty much get a free rein. The pharmaceutical industry has been trying to buy a free rein in Washington, and so far they've done a very good job. There are three major consequences of this Bartlett decision. The first is generic drug manufacturers have virtual immunity, but in doing so, in acquiring immunity, they also have no incentives to take unsafe drugs off the market or to issue warnings about unsafe drugs that might hinder their sales. The second consequence is that citizens, such as Karen Bartlett, are left without a remedy. But the third major and biggest of these three consequences is that there's now a major safety gap in generic drug use. Generic drugs are dangerous. And as you said, the public citizen identified over a period of January 2008 to March 2013, they identified 53 different drugs that had to be black boxed. They had to have a black box warning issued after they became generic.
I think one of the most astounding things that people need to be aware of is that with generic drugs, they are not allowed to go and change their label when new problems arise. They have to wait for the name brand drug to do that. Then they're allowed only to change their label to reflect what the name brand has done. And in a lot of cases, the name brand is no longer on the market. So what happens then?
Well, the name brand drug no longer has an incentive. As a general rule, after generics come on the market and take a major portion of the market share, the brand name drug has no incentive to come in and spend a lot of money to go through the CBE process or to go through any process to issue new warnings. So the result is, with this ruling, there are no warnings. There are no changes in warnings. There are no taking of the defective drugs off the market. And drugs can be on the market for 40 and 50 years and still be found to be dangerous. For example, Phenergan was approved by the FDA in '51. 53 years later, in 2004, it was black boxed. Reglan was approved in '79. 30 years later, in 2009, black box warning. Darvon and Darvocet approved in '57, and in 2010, 53 years later, black box warning. Prozac, which is still on the market, was approved in '87, black boxed in 2004. So I mean, the fact that it's been on the market a long time doesn't mean that it's got a safety history, because it doesn't.
Right, and I think one of the things that is so important about this, a lot of American consumers, as you pointed out earlier, 75% are taking generics. And that's either because their insurance will only cover generics if one is available, or in a lot of cases, people who don't have insurance. They can't afford this name brand drug that is selling for $300 a bottle versus the generic that might sell for $20 or $30. So they're dependent upon these. And again, this is mostly the pharmaceutical industry preying on low and middle income Americans. And that's what is so important about this story. The FDA is not doing anything. Is there any action at the FDA to fix this problem?
Well, the status today is that the FDA finally, after Bartlett, has placed this rule change for the CBE rule on the calendar for September. But the FDA has known about this. Public Citizen has had a long-standing petition pending before the FDA, asking them to make this change long before Mensing, before Bartlett. They've been begging them to please make this rule change, and they've delayed and delayed and delayed. Now, after Bartlett, they say, okay, we'll put this rule change on the calendar for September. But the FDA has a long history of protecting drug companies, so we'll just have to wait and see what happens in September. I'll believe it when I see it.
Well, Howard, thank you very much for staying on this issue for us.
My pleasure, Farron.
And that's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringoffireradio.com, on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio, and on Facebook. I'm Farron Cousins, and we'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire.